you know, this place is so unique, so beautiful. There's so much history here. It's got to be put down on paper. So I came up with an idea, you know what, I'm going to talk about Transfer Day. The book will be about Transfer Day. But a story is not a story without one thing. What is the major part of any story, the most important part of any story? Conflict. You don't have a story to tell unless you have a problem to resolve. Every story that you read in your life, it's all variations of the same theme. It's the main character, who we call the protagonist, has a problem, some kind of an issue that he's grappling with, that he's dealing with. And it builds and builds and builds until you reach a climax point where the intensity of the action takes place, and then it resolves itself. So I needed, this is what I lacked. I lacked tension. I lacked a problem. So I had to come up with something. Well, I knew that in those days there was an office of the Hamburg America Lines, a German steamship company that still exists today in different forms. But I knew it existed in those days, and it's very likely that their office was being used to help the Germans conduct the war into the New World, bringing the war onto these shores. So I started digging and digging and digging and digging, and I found, actually, it was what we say, like Providence. Providence brought me to a man in Germany whose grandfather actually was working in this office in St. Thomas in the Danish West Indies, and he actually was spying for Germany. So there I have my conflict. There I have my, that's exactly what I needed. That's exactly what I was looking for. So I had to bring certain characters together, and using this area of conflict, create a story out of it. So that's why it took me a long time, probably a year. I used a lot of military historians, gave me a lot of advice, and I created this story. I developed characters, and using this conflict within the whole context of the transfer ceremony, or the transferring of the islands, and that's how I got my story. Now, I got for you a video that was locally produced in the Virgin Islands about the transfer, and it talks about some of the people that talk in the video are people that actually eyewitnessed it, so they're very, very old people. But it tells you a little bit of background about what it was like to be living in a Danish colony in the West Indies, and to be literally handed to another nation. And one day the Dannebrog comes down, and the American Stars and Stripes goes up. And what did that feel like? What was that like to be living in a Danish colony, and one day all of a sudden you wake up and you're an American?
Taking control of the island. America, with the world at war, peacefully establishes a new government. But the guns are speaking across the sea.
I remember the island when it was sold. And I can tell you what happened that day. We were up, you know where the fort is? We were up there. There's a porch leading that you could look down into the legislature. In those days, we didn't call it a legislature. It was called the barracks. We looked in down barracks where we could see the Danish soldiers. What was happening? We were crying. We cried bitterly because we knew the life that we led under the Danish government. We were sold to a friendly government, and we knew what we had. We were poor, but yet happiness. So we all, when this was taking place, we knew we were losing our country, where we were living in. And we were going to what we did not know. So it was a mixed feeling, sad and glad. On transfer day, we didn't have any party because it was a solemn day. And it was not a day of rejoicing. It was a mixed feeling, as I say. We were glad of the opportunity of being sold a rich country. But we were very sad to leave what we had, the Danish government. When we were sold to the Americans, it took a long time for us to settle down and be citizens of America. It took years.
As I remembered, transfer day, the schools were asked, the teachers took the children up on the pier where this was taking place, you know? We stood there, and people gathered there, and then when they were ready, they hoisted down, they took down the Danish flag, and then they put out the American flag. I think while they were coming down, the children sang the Danish anthem.
So you can kind of see the influence of that. Most of the people, I think everyone that spoke by now has passed away. It was quite a number of years ago. But I have actual pictures, photographs from that transfer ceremony, which you can pass around, which shows the two different guards of honor, the Danish and the Marines, the American Marines, how they, it was a very formal ceremony. And just some pictures of the island as well, what life was like back then. Very interesting historical photos. Here's a bunch of photos. And anytime you commit your thoughts, your writing to paper, you have just entered into the historical record, whether or not you know it. A diary, which you think is private, and you keep, and you put away somewhere, and you say, well, I'm tired of it, I'm not going to write anymore. Someday, maybe decades later, that diary could be found, and it can become entered into the historical record, as we've seen with the Diary of Anne Frank. She never believed, when she was a teenage girl, that her diary would become a motion picture and a play, and that her name would be known in the entire world. But she entered into the historical record what she lived through during those years in hiding. So each one of you who can put a pen to a paper and can write your life story, or can write about the times that you live in, just as a side note, just so you know that that's part of this, that could become part of the historical record, and you never know that, you know, each one of you has a unique vision, a unique story to tell, and as we saw with someone like Anne Frank, who never thought that her story would become so famous. Well, look what happened. But I think the number one thing to remember is persistence. Sometimes, like, I always say, like, this story was written already. I just had to find it. I had to find this story. It was there. It was somewhere there waiting for me, and I had to take it and I had to write it down. So it's if you keep, you know, digging, the story will come alive. So there's an interesting quote that I heard recently by a famous author that probably your parents or grandparents used to read, Somerset Maugham. He was a very famous English writer. He said there's 4 simple rules for writing a novel. Unfortunately, nobody knows what they are, but they're out there. So basically.